I was in the middle of recalibrating the final encryption sequence, fine-tuning the algorithms that would secure our next transmission to the International Space Station, when my phone buzzed insistently. I glanced down at the screen. Emergency family dinner. Harper's text read. Mom says it's serious. In that instant, I felt my heart stutter, not because I thought my mother-in-law's tone signified true urgency, but because I sensed a collision coming. An inevitable collision between their version of me and the reality of who I really was. I tapped out a quick response, on my way. Then I saved my progress, shut down my workstation, and slipped into jeans that had seen better days, laced up scuffed boots, and shrugged into a worn t-shirt whose neckline was fraying. To anyone looking from the outside, I was a man who had parked his dreams long ago. I navigated the afternoon traffic in my beat-up sedan, a car as unremarkable as the clothes I wore. The engine rattled familiarly, reminding me of midnight debugging sessions in a cramped office, when my only company was half-empty coffee mugs and the hum of servers. While they fretted about my lack of a proper job, I'd spent countless nights developing quantum-resistant encryption platforms that would one day redefine secure communications. But tonight, all of that excellence would be cloaked by their misconceptions. Tonight, I would show them that perception can be an astonishingly stubborn force. Pulling up to the entrance of my in-laws' mansion felt surreal. The gatehouse was immaculate, the hedges sculpted into geometric precision, and marble columns flanking the porte cochere gleamed in the early evening light. I parked close to the front door, stepped out, and ran a hand through my rumpled hair. Inside, the smell of Moroccan spices lingered, mingling with polished wood and heirloom crystal. Their foyer was a cathedral of affluence, high ceilings draped with a crystal chandelier, expensive art lining the walls, and a polished marble floor that reflected each chandelier prism like a kaleidoscope. In the silence that seemed to prefigure drama, I found my breath catching in my throat. As I entered the dining room, I saw Harper hovering near the head of the table, flanked by her mother, Marjorie, and her father, Douglas. The table was set for 8, though I knew they wouldn't be breaking bread tonight. Plates remained pristinely untouched. Polished silverware lay waiting for courses that would never come. Marjorie's cool gaze met mine. Her eyes, sharp as knives, seemed to dissect every thread of my thrifted outfit. Douglas sat beside her, expression unreadable, as if he were mentalizing this scene like a shareholder meeting, waiting for my quarterly performance report. Behind them, family portraits hung in matching frames, Harper as a child in a church choir, Blythe in cap and gown, Ron shaking hands with a competitor. I felt the weight of their history seated before me. Harper offered a tight-lipped smile, her cheeks flushed. "We're glad you could make it," she said, voice measured. But I caught the tremor in her hands clasped before her. I understood. She had seen the look in her mother's eyes when the invitation was issued. A look that said she was about to try to straighten a life that, in their view, had gone decidedly crooked. I pulled out the chair at the foot of the table and sat, smoothing back my hair to charm some semblance of composure from my anxious nerves. Marjorie cleared her throat and clicked a remote. A projector descended from the ceiling, and a slide flickered to life on a screen behind her. "It's time we talked about your future," she announced, voice crisp. A printed resume appeared, my resume, complete with outdated job titles and an obscured email address from 3 years ago. They had clearly scavenged LinkedIn for scraps, convinced I'd languished in professional limbo. For a moment, I caught Harper's gaze. Her eyes darted to me, questioning if I'd completely lost my mind by not setting them straight right away. But I remained calm, waiting for the opportune moment to let truth obliterate their misconceptions. Marjorie flipped to slide 1, bullet points listing engineering assistant, Midwest Tech Solutions, 2018, present, and project coordinator, Suburban Systems, 2016 to 2018. Underneath, a line about seeking stable career in established firm. I felt a hot surge in my chest. Those roles had existed in some parallel universe, jobs I'd taken, briefly, while building the hidden empire no one believed existed. I let Marjorie finish her scripted commentary. "You've always been brilliant, but you lack direction. We have compiled a list of job openings, entry-level positions at local banks, sales associate openings at insurance companies, and other respectable opportunities." A manila envelope slid along the table toward me. I lifted it and opened it, revealing laminated sheets of want ads with headlines like "Immediate Openings," "Customer Service Republic," "Training Program," "Junior Analyst," and "Apply Now," "Sales Trainee." Harper sat at my left, tension radiating off her in small vibrations. On my right, Blythe and her husband, Ron, exchanged knowing glances. Ron smirked and whispered something in Blythe's ear. I heard her bite back laughter. I kept my face neutral, suppressing a retort. The room felt claustrophobic, as if their pity eyes and patronizing smiles were a vice tightening around my ribs. I remembered Harper once admiring my early prototype, the first crude design of our quantum encryption engine, and calling it cute. If they could see what I really built, their words would evaporate like smoke in sunlight. Douglas cleared his throat. Seraphed voice measured. Atlas Quell mentioned you in a press release 6 months ago. I looked at him, eyebrows raised. Atlas Quell? I echoed. He frowned, fidgeting. Yes, that fledgling firm you founded. We heard rumors, but... Marjorie interjected. That's ancient history. You left that behind, didn't you? You chose to do who knows what instead of something real. I let their misperception hang in the air before speaking. Actually, I never left it behind. My voice was low, each word deliberate. I've been working full-time. My day job is... I paused, letting suspense creep across their faces. Chief Systems Architect at EtherCore Technologies. Their pity stares flickered with confusion, then skepticism. I leaned forward. I'm the founder. In the silence that followed, the fine china rattled as someone's hand tightened around a water glass. Marjorie's spoon clattered against her plate. Harper's jaw slackened. That's not possible, Marjorie breathed. I reached inside my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The real one, the phone loaded with confidential corporate emails and encrypted chat logs. Habitually, I unlocked it with a fingerprint and flicked to the EtherCore app. On screen, world maps pinpointed global servers, live feed from our satellite uplinks, and blinking notifications from investors. A notification banner proclaimed, EtherCore valuation now $18 billion. Blythe snapped her fingers. Explain, she demanded. You built what? I tapped a few icons, enlarged a headline from a recent press release, EtherCore Technologies breaks ground on new quantum computing lab. Beneath it, a subheading, stealth startup founded 2 years ago under the alias Atlas Quell. I watched the realization dawn on them. Their nephew, son-in-law, and brother-in-law had been masterminding an operation that dwarfed their business combined. Douglas's face turned ashen. His fork clattered onto his plate. Harper covered her mouth, eyes wide with astonishment. I leaned back and let it sink in. Marjorie trembled, her carefully coiffed hair trembling with dismay. Why didn't you tell us? She whispered. I traced the grain of the mahogany table, choosing my words. Because you never asked. You fashioned an image of me long before you knew the truth. You wanted a version of Scott that fit your expectations. Their eyes flickered between my thrifted boots and the live corporate dashboard on my screen. I felt a strange surge of triumph mingled with pity for them, trapped by their own assumptions. Harper swallowed hard, tears glossing her lashes. I thought you were struggling. I sent you job ads because I wanted stability for us. I shook my head gently. Stability is a moving target, Harper. This, I tapped my phone screen, is what I built when I was free from second-guessing. A stunned hush fell over the table. Marjorie dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed napkin. Douglas swallowed, voice swallowed in his throat. Ron cleared his throat and attempted a weak smile. So, what happens now? He glanced at Blythe, who shuddered. I placed my phone face down on the table and folded my arms. Now? We recalibrate our understanding of what a good job looks like. I looked directly at Marjorie, who still fluttered like a wounded bird. You may want to revise that resume. Start adding headlines. Then I stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Lunch was no longer on their agenda. Dinner wouldn't be served. I turned to Harper and offered my hand. She hesitated, eyes red. I squeezed gently. Let's go. As we left the mansion's ornate foyer, the last of their questions died on their lips. I climbed into my car, t-shirt, boots, and all, carrying the weight of a truth they never saw coming. And in that moment, I realized. This family intervention was never about dinner. It was about unveiling who I truly was. It's time we talked about your future, Marjorie said, her voice heavy with the kind of authority that made her the queen of this house, the matriarch of the dynasty she'd built around a man like Douglas. She flipped to slide 1, and the whir of the small projector above the table hummed like the prelude to a corporate funeral. I tried to suppress a smirk as her pointer hovered over my name, misspelled in the heading. while the rest of the family settled into their seats like members of a board meeting they'd been rehearsing for weeks. Harper sat to my left, eyes darting between me and her mother. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, a silent apology, maybe, or a confession that she knew this would be painful. Across from me, Blythe perched on the edge of her chair, eyes gleaming with the anticipation of an older sibling watching the youngest finally get a scolding. Ron, her husband, leaned back with his arms crossed, smug satisfaction written in every angle of his posture. Douglas was at the head of the table, his jaw set like granite, the embodiment of solemn support for his wife's crusade to straighten out the black sheep of the family. Marjorie, in her navy blue power suit and diamond brooch, was ready for battle. "Scott," she began, "we've all been worried about you." She paused for dramatic effect. "You've always been so bright, but your career choices," she gestured at the slide behind her, a blown-up version of my resume, incomplete and outdated. "They don't reflect the potential we know you have." The projector beam made my face glow on the screen like a ghost, a parody of the man they thought they knew. Under my name, the bullet points listed my old positions: project coordinator, engineering assistant, contracted developer. Each one was outdated, each one a relic of the years when I was laying the foundation for EtherCore in the shadows, using every dollar I made to fuel something bigger than any of them could comprehend. Marjorie clicked to slide 2, which displayed a pie chart, color-coded, complete with labels and footnotes, representing job opportunities Scott should consider. The largest wedge was financial services, followed by sales and marketing, customer support, and education. She didn't even pause to ask what I wanted. "We've put together a list of opportunities," she continued, nodding at Harper, who slid a manila envelope across the table toward me. "These are safe jobs, Scott. Jobs with benefits, a 401k, a real future. You can't go on like this forever." I let my fingers brush the envelope, but I didn't open it. Instead, I studied Harper's face. Her expression was a study in polite regret, her brows slightly furrowed as though she were willing me to understand. "We just want what's best for you," she whispered, her voice so low I wondered if the others even heard her. Blythe seized her moment, leaning forward, her perfect hair gleaming in the chandelier's glow. "Max just made VP at the hedge fund," she announced, glancing at Ron like they'd rehearsed this. "He's already looking at buying a second house." "A real house, with a pool and everything." Ron let out a soft chuckle. "Yeah, Max is really crushing it." He folded his arms tighter, like he'd locked in the final judgment. Marjorie's pointer swooped in on the screen, highlighting the part of my resume that said freelance developer. "This isn't a sustainable career path," she insisted, her voice growing sharper. "You've been drifting. Harper says you've been working on side projects, but at some point, you need to get serious." Harper's eyes flickered to me, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. I met her gaze, willing her to remember all those nights I'd come home exhausted but glowing with quiet triumph. Each breakthrough a step closer to the future I'd been building. She'd asked me once what I'd been working on so late, and I'd told her, "It's complicated." She'd smiled then, but now her smile was gone, replaced by that same pity I saw in her mother's eyes. Marjorie advanced to slide 3, now listing companies, local banks, insurance firms, a few mid-tier logistics companies, each with salaries that probably wouldn't cover a single component of the quantum encryption server I'd built from scratch. "Scott, these are solid opportunities," she said, her voice warm with the confidence of someone who'd never spent a day in the real world of bleeding-edge tech. "They'd love to have someone with your background." Douglas finally spoke up, his tone low but carrying the same weight as a judge's gavel. "Son," he said, though he'd never called me that without the formality that made it sound like an obligation, "it's time to think about your family. Harper deserves stability. She deserves a man with a real job, not this." He waved a hand at my resume, as if dismissing it like a piece of junk mail. Blythe added, "We just don't understand why you'd throw away a chance at a secure life. I mean, even Max." I stopped her with a look, then finally spoke, my voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Max is doing great, I'm sure," I said, folding my hands on the table. "But let's be clear, what you're talking about isn't about me. It's about you. It's about your comfort, your reputation, your need to believe that the world works the way you think it does." Marjorie recoiled as though I'd struck her. "That's not fair," she stammered. "Isn't it?" I countered, my eyes steady on hers. Because while you've all been so worried about my future, I've been working every day on something that's going to change the world. Something you can't see on a pie chart. Ron snorted. Yeah, right? Another app. Or what? A website. I let the silence stretch before leaning back and giving him a smile that felt sharper than any knife. You'll find out soon enough. Marjorie's pointer trembled, and she set it down like it suddenly weighed too much. Her voice dropped, as if trying to salvage the intervention from complete collapse. Scott, she whispered, we just want to help. I nodded, my smile fading. I know, I said, but you can't help me with this. This is bigger than any of you. And in that moment, I realized they'd never believed in me, not the real me. They believed in the story they'd written in their heads, and they'd been so invested in that version that they'd never asked who I really was. I stood, pushing the envelope aside. I appreciate the effort, I said, the words tasting like smoke on my tongue. But I'm not interested in your job listings. I turned and left the table, my footsteps echoing in the silence they left behind, knowing that soon, very soon, they'd understand exactly what I'd been working on all those long nights they thought I'd been drifting. And when that day came, the pity in their eyes would be replaced by something else. Respect, maybe, or at least the knowledge that they'd underestimated me for the last time. We're cutting you off until you get a real job, Marjorie announced, her voice slicing through the room with the precision of a guillotine. The declaration didn't land with the weight she'd probably intended. In fact, I nearly laughed, because the words were as empty as the job listings they'd printed for me in that manila envelope now resting on the table like a paper tombstone. I hadn't accepted a dime from them in 2 years, not since I'd realized that every favor came with strings attached, every gesture of generosity laced with their need to shape me into someone I wasn't. Douglas sat next to her, silent, his hand resting on the table like a benediction, like the final seal of approval on their verdict. Harper's eyes flickered from Marjorie to me, then back to Marjorie again, as though she was trying to decide which side she should be on. She looked smaller than usual in that moment, and for a brief second I felt a pang of something that might have been pity. But then she added, "You've got talent, Scott, but you're wasting it." Her words dripped with disappointment, a bitterness that left a sour taste in the air. I met her eyes and saw not anger, but a kind of tired resignation, like she'd given up on me long before this dinner ever started. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my legs out in front of me, and let the words wash over me. I stared down at the one ads they'd printed, rows of bank teller positions, insurance clerk roles, junior sales gigs, each one a paper prison they wanted to lock me in. I could almost hear Marjorie's voice as I read them. Safe, steady, stable. Words that meant the death of every idea that had ever kept me up at night, scribbling notes on the backs of receipts, coding into the small hours, chasing the spark of something bigger than the life they'd imagined for me. I thought about Harper's words, how she'd once called my work cute, when I showed her the first prototype of the encryption module I'd been building. I'd worked on that project with a feverish kind of obsession, every line of code a small rebellion against the safe, steady, stable world they wanted for me. And when I finally let her see it, when I finally cracked open the vault and let her peek inside, she'd smiled politely, then turned back to her phone. Cute. She'd called it cute. And now, sitting at this table, that memory felt like a rock in my chest. Marjorie cleared her throat, her voice trembling just slightly. Scott, we love you. We want what's best for you. But we can't keep supporting choices that make no sense. Harper deserves a husband with ambition, with a plan, not someone chasing fantasies. She gestured at Douglas, who nodded solemnly. It's not too late. These jobs, she tapped the envelope. They're real opportunities. A chance to build a future. We're offering you stability, Scott. I took a slow breath, felt the air burn in my lungs. I glanced around the table. Douglas's stern face, Harper's worried frown, Marjorie's eyes wide and hopeful in that way that always felt like a trap. Blythe and Ron had retreated into an uncomfortable silence, their earlier smugness replaced by awkward tension. I imagined the seconds ticking by, each one a small, polite eulogy for the man they tried to mold. The man they thought I was. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge they couldn't miss. You're cutting me off until I get a job that fits your definition of real. Even though I haven't taken anything from you in years. Marjorie's lips parted, but I didn't give her a chance to respond. My condo? Paid for by me. The car? Mine. The anniversary trip Harper thought her parents paid for? Every dollar came from my own bank account. I met Harper's eyes, saw the faint shock register there, the realization that she'd never bothered to ask. She'd just assumed the story her parents had written for me was true. Marjorie's face paled, her hand trembling against the table. "Scott, that's true," I said. "Every word. You think I've been drifting, living off your pity. But I've been building something you couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now you're telling me you're cutting me off." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I was never connected to your lifeline in the first place." Harper's voice was small, but it cut deeper than her mother's. "Scott," she said, "you've got so much talent. But you're wasting it on whatever it is you're doing. You could be a manager by now. A VP. Something we could all be proud of." Her voice broke slightly at the end, as though the disappointment was too heavy to carry any further. I leaned forward, my elbows on the table, and let them all see the truth in my eyes. "Cute," I said, the word rolling off my tongue like poison. "That's what you called my work. The first time I showed you what I was building. You smiled and called it cute. Do you have any idea what that project turned into?" I didn't wait for an answer. "It turned into something that's going to change the world. And while you were busy comparing me to Blythe's hedge fund husband, I was working with people whose names you'll never see in the news. People who are shaping the future of technology in ways you can't even imagine." Douglas's face darkened, his brow furrowing as though he'd just discovered an unwelcome truth. "Scott," he said, voice tight, "this isn't about changing the world. It's about providing for your family. About being a man." The words landed like a slap. I met his gaze unflinching, feeling something inside me harden. "I have been providing," I said, my voice like a blade. "Every late night, every missed dinner, every hour I spent writing code and building systems you'll never understand. That was me providing. That was me building a future that doesn't rely on your approval or your money. I didn't need your support then, and I don't need it now." Marjorie opened her mouth, but the words tangled in her throat. The envelope on the table seemed to shrink, its job listings now a sad little relic of the small world they wanted me to live in. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood on tile loud in the hush that had settled over the room. I stood and looked down at Harper, her eyes brimming with questions she'd never thought to ask. "You always wanted me to be something I'm not," I said. "You wanted safe, steady, stable. But that's not me. I'm the man who doesn't sleep until the world's better than it was yesterday. I'm the man who builds the future while the rest of you are busy trying to hold on to the past." I turned to Marjorie and Douglas, their faces pale and silent. "You're cutting me off," I said, my voice steady. "But you never had the power to hold me back." And with that, I walked out of the room, out of the house, and into a night that felt more like freedom than I'd ever known. I just started to stand, the envelope of job listings untouched on the table in front of me, when everyone's phones lit up at once, a collective, vibrating hum that cut through the tense quiet like a blade. The sound was so sudden, it snapped the air taut, drawing every head in the room to their screens. I saw Harper's hand tremble as she lifted her phone, as narrowing as she tried to make sense of the headline that was already setting social media on fire. Douglas's phone buzzed on the table, screen illuminating the fine lines of his worried face. Marjorie's phone pinged, too, and she snatched it up as if it were a lifeline. Even Blythe and Ron, perched at the far end of the table, leaned forward, their faces bathed in the cold glow of breaking news. I didn't need to look at mine. I already knew what was coming. But I watched their faces anyway, because that was the moment I'd been waiting for. The freight train that was about to collide with their carefully constructed illusion of who I was. Breaking, latest self-made billionaire reveals identity. The words glowed on Harper's screen, casting an eerie light on her shocked expression. Her lips parted, her eyes darting to me, then back to the headline as if trying to reconcile what she was reading with the man standing in front of her. Marjorie's jaw dropped. Atlas Quell, founder of EtherCore Technologies, revealed as mastermind behind $14 billion stealth quantum computing firm, Harper read aloud, her voice cracking in disbelief. The room fell silent, the projector above the table flickering forgotten as the weight of the words settled on the air like a thundercloud. I saw Blythe's wine glass slip from her fingers, hit the table, and shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. The shards skittered across the polished wood, reflecting the pale light of the chandelier like broken promises. Ron's mouth moved, but no sound came out, his confidence evaporating faster than the wine that now stained the tablecloth. Douglas froze, fork halfway to his mouth, his face drained of color. He stared at me as if I'd just morphed into an alien. Is this you? He finally managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. His disbelief hung in the air, suspended between accusation and awe. I nodded, feeling the calm that comes when the truth finally breaks free. Yes, I said, my voice low but unwavering. But that valuation's outdated. We crossed $18 billion this morning. A hush swept over the room like a sudden wind. Marjorie's mouth worked silently, her carefully practiced confidence cracking as she struggled to process the reality she'd spent so long denying. Harper's face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Scott," she said, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell us?" She sounded like a child discovering her favorite bedtime story was a lie. I met her gaze evenly. "Because none of you ever asked," I said. "You were too busy deciding who I was supposed to be to notice who I actually am." Marjorie's hand fluttered to her throat, her eyes darting to Douglas as if searching for some lifeline. But you always acted like. Her words dissolved into confusion. Like I needed your help? I finished for her, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. That was intentional. I wanted to see how far you'd go trying to fix me. Blythe looked like she just swallowed glass, her lips a thin line of disbelief. You let us think you were struggling?" I finished again. "Yeah, I let you think that because it was easier than trying to explain quantum entanglement over Sunday dinner." My voice was steady, even calm, but inside I felt a roaring fire. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the moment when the foundation I'd laid in secret would stand tall and unshakable against the assumptions they'd built around me. Douglas set his fork down with a clatter, his expression shifting from shock to something like regret. "Scott." I didn't know. I met his eyes, saw the years of quiet judgment, the weight of every disapproving look. "No," I said. You didn't. You didn't even try." Harper's lips trembled. But we're family." I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of spilled wine and cheap cologne. "Family," I repeated, the word tasting like something foreign on my tongue. "Family is supposed to see you, not the version they want you to be, but the real you. You all failed the test." Marjorie's hand slapped the table, her eyes shining with a mix of anger and desperation. "You deceived us," she spat. "You made us look like fools." I didn't flinch. "No," I said quietly. "You made yourselves look like fools when you decided your version of me was more important than the truth. I never asked you to believe in me. I just asked you to see me. And you couldn't do it." The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in on all their carefully constructed lies. I saw Blythe's fingers twitching, Ron's Adam's apple bobbing nervously, Douglas's eyes cast downward, the weight of realization pressing on his shoulders like iron. Harper's hand reached for mine across the table, but I didn't move. "Scott," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Please. We didn't know." I studied her face, the woman I loved, the woman who'd believed the man they'd told her I was. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." Outside the window, city lights flickered like a million little beacons of progress, each one a reminder of the world I'd built while they were busy building cages around me. I stood slowly, the chair scraping the polished floor like a final verdict. "You wanted a man who fit your mold," I said, my voice firm. "But I'm not that man. I'm the man who built the mold that's going to shatter yours." I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving behind the broken glass and the even more broken illusions. As I stepped into the night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all these years. The truth was finally out, and for the first time in a long time, I was free to be exactly who I was. "You built that startup in secret." Harper's voice trembled as she said it, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve like she was clinging to something solid in a world that had just collapsed. Her eyes were wide, searching mine for answers that wouldn't fit neatly into the boxes she'd spent years building for me. I took a slow breath, letting the air fill my lungs before exhaling every last piece of the old charade. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the phone I never brought to family dinners, the one with the secure encryption protocols and direct lines to defense contractors, tech giants, and a senator's chief of staff. It felt like a key in my hand, cold and heavy, unlocking the door to a part of my life I'd kept hidden behind a wall of thrift store jeans and polite smiles. Harper's gaze followed my hand as I tapped the screen and opened my secure workspace. Notifications flickered to life, requests for proposals from international governments, licensing contracts worth millions, news alerts from tech journalists hungry for a quote from the elusive Atlas Quell. "Look," I said, my voice calm but carrying the weight of every late night and early morning I'd sacrificed for this. "This is my life. This is what I've been building while you all thought I was wasting my time." I turned the screen toward her so she could see the dashboard of EtherCore, live quantum simulations running across a network of servers I designed, project milestones ticked off like an engineer's holy grail, and a pending licensing contract worth $9.2 million waiting for my approval. The numbers were almost obscene in their scale. Too big to fit in the boxes her mother had drawn on the PowerPoint slides back at dinner. I watched as her eyes widened, pupils dilating like they'd just absorbed the light of 1,000 possibilities. "9.2 million, she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. She reached out, almost touching the screen, but pulled her hand back like it might burn her. How long?" she began, but the question crumbled in her throat. I saw the edges of her world unraveling as she tried to piece together how the man she thought she'd married had managed to build an empire under her nose. The truth was, I'd started building this the day after Marjorie first called my career a cute little hobby. That was the spark that lit the fuse, a quiet, stubborn flame that refused to die, no matter how many times they tried to smother it with their polite condescension and job listings from local banks. Every dinner I'd sat through, every time they'd asked me how the job search was going, every time they'd compared me to Blythe's hedge fund husband, I'd taken that indignity and forged it into something they couldn't ignore. "Why didn't you say anything?" Harper's voice cracked like glass under too much pressure. Her hand covered her mouth, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and hurt. "Why didn't you let me help?" The words landed like accusations, but I didn't flinch. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times. "Because you weren't asking," I said evenly. "You were managing a version of me that never existed. You wanted the man in the thrifted jeans who needed your help to get his life together. You wanted the safe, steady, stable version of me. But that's not who I am." I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "I'm the man who was building the systems the ISS uses to communicate. I'm the man who created quantum encryption protocols that governments are lining up to license. And I'm the man who," I held up the phone, letting the glow reflect in her teary eyes, "just signed off on a licensing deal worth more than the entire net worth of every person in this room combined." Harper's lips parted, her eyes darting to her mother, who sat at the table with a stunned expression that was equal parts confusion and rage. Marjorie's fingers drummed on the table, her diamond ring catching the light like a warning. This is insane," she muttered, voice tight. "How could you hide this from us?" "From Harper?" She shot me a look that could have curdled steel. "We're family," she snapped, like that word was a weapon she could use to cut me down. I tilted my head slightly, studying her face. The lines of worry, the carefully applied makeup that cracked at the edges when she was under pressure. "Family," I repeated, the word cold on my tongue. "Family is supposed to lift you up, not try to box you in." I shifted my gaze to Douglas, who looked like he'd just realized the floor under his feet was quicksand. "And family is supposed to trust you to build your own path, not force you into theirs because it makes them feel better." Harper's tears fell then, silent but heavy, landing on the tablecloth like ink blots in a confession she'd never wanted to write. "But she started, and then stopped, her voice strangled. "I just wanted to help," she whispered, her eyes on her hands. Her wedding ring gleamed in the low light, a reminder of promises made under the pretense that she understood who I was. But she'd never asked. None of them had. They'd accepted the surface, my beat-up Civic, my worn boots, the carefully curated narrative I'd let them believe, because it fit the story they wanted to tell. I let the silence stretch, the tension in the room coiling tighter than any algorithm I'd ever written. Then I spoke, voice steady as a drumbeat. "I know," I said. "I know you thought you were helping. But every time you handed me a job listing or compared me to Max or asked why I hadn't done something more normal, you were telling me you didn't believe in me." I let that sink in. Harper's shoulders sagged, her tears now an unstoppable flood. "I believed in you," she whispered. I shook my head, the smile that crossed my lips more sad than anything. "No," I said gently. "You believed in the version of me you wanted me to be. You didn't believe in the man I actually am." Ron cleared his throat from the end of the table, his voice low and awkward. "So you're really Atlas Quell," he said, his eyes darting between me and his phone like he couldn't decide which was real. I met his gaze, felt the disbelief in his voice, and let the truth stand like a monument. I've always been Atlas Quell, I said. You just never saw it. The mask I'd worn, the one with the scuffed boots and thrift store jeans, fell away in that moment, leaving only the man I'd been all along. The man who'd built an empire in secret, who'd shaped a future they couldn't even imagine. And as I looked around that room, at Harper's tears, at Marjorie's disbelief, at Douglas's quiet shame, I knew the man they'd tried to build was gone, and the man they'd tried to hide was finally free. You turned down Atlas Quell's proposal 2 years ago. Douglas's voice was a strained whisper, as though the words themselves might shatter the reality he'd built for himself. He sat there, rigid in his leather chair, his face a mask of disbelief and regret. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of a linen napkin as if it were a lifeline, something to ground him in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. Marjorie's eyes widened with horror as the realization crashed over her like a wave. The lines around her mouth deepened, her lips trembling as she looked from Douglas to me, as if hoping one of us might tell her this was all just a cruel joke. But there was no punchline coming. She'd rejected me twice, dismissed my proposals as academic nonsense, when I'd offered EtherCore's partnership to Douglas's firm in good faith. I'd extended the olive branch, given them a seat at the table before the table even had a name, and they'd laughed me out of the room. Ron tried to fill the silence with a brittle laugh, but the sound died in his throat when he saw my expression. Guess I should update my resume, he muttered, half under his breath. The grin he wore looked more like a grimace now, the bravado stripped away. Blythe sat next to him, her eyes darting from screen to screen, as if she could somehow calculate the years she'd lost by aligning herself with the wrong horse. She looked like she was already plotting how to pivot, how to position herself in my new orbit now that the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. And Harper, my wife. She sat there with her hands folded in her lap, staring at them like they were foreign objects. Her voice was so small when she finally spoke that I almost missed it. You never needed us, she whispered, her words heavy with a grief she hadn't yet named. You just let us believe you did. Her eyes lifted to mine, and in that gaze, I saw the shattered pieces of her illusion. The man she'd thought she married, the man who needed guidance and steady paychecks and job listings, he'd never existed. She'd been living with a ghost. I met her gaze, steady, unwavering. You never asked what I was working on, I said, my voice as calm as the hum of my servers in the lab. You never asked what kept me up at night or what I was building when the rest of the world was sleeping. You all just assumed I was drifting, wasting time. But I was laying the foundation for something you couldn't even imagine. Douglas's face drained of color, his voice barely a rasp. That proposal, you offered it to me, he said, eyes haunted. You gave me a chance to get in at the ground floor, and he looked down at his hands, like the answer was written there. I called it nonsense, he finished, the shame in his tone thick enough to drown in. I nodded slowly. You did, I said. Twice. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, letting the gravity of the moment settle. And now your firm stock is in free fall, Douglas. You bet against the future, and the future doesn't take prisoners. The silence in the room was deafening. I could almost hear the gears turning in Blythe's head as she recalculated her alliances, her bright smile from earlier now replaced with a tight, strategic expression. Ron's face was pale, his bravado gone. Marjorie looked like she'd been hollowed out, her carefully constructed persona deflating under the weight of her misjudgment. Harper's voice was a whisper when she finally spoke again. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, tears glistening in her eyes. Why didn't you tell me what you were building? I looked at her, the woman I'd thought I'd spend my life with, and felt the ache of every moment I'd tried to share my dreams only to be met with polite nods and veiled disappointment. Because you never wanted to hear it, I said softly. Every time I tried to tell you about my work, you'd change the subject or hand me another job posting. You wanted stability, predictability, a man you could explain to your mother. But I was never going to be that man. My voice didn't crack. It felt like steel, forged in every rejection, every long night of code, every dollar I'd poured into the vision they'd never even tried to understand. Marjorie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. We were trying to protect you, she said, voice brittle. We wanted you to have a safety net. I shook my head, a small, sad smile crossing my face. You didn't want to protect me, I said. You wanted to protect yourselves from the fear that I might fail. But failure is part of building something new. I embraced that risk while you all clung to your comfort zones. Douglas buried his face in his hands, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like a mountain. I didn't see, he murmured. I didn't see what you were really doing. I watched him, the man who'd once held court at this table like a king, now reduced to a man grappling with the realization that his legacy had slipped through his fingers because he'd failed to recognize the revolution happening in his own backyard. Ron cleared his throat, trying to salvage some dignity. Well, he said, voice shaky, I guess we underestimated you. His laugh was weak, forced, the kind of sound people make when they're trying not to drown. Blythe shot him a look that said shut up in no uncertain terms. Harper's tears finally spilled over, streaking her face in silent confession. I don't know how to be your partner now, she whispered. I don't even know who you are anymore. I looked at her, the woman I'd once thought understood me better than anyone. I'm the same man I've always been, I said. The difference is, now you can't ignore it. She reached across the table, but I didn't take her hand. There was nothing left to say that could bridge the chasm between us. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the truth settled like dust in the aftermath of a demolition. I stood, pushing my chair back, the scrape of wood on tile loud in the thick silence. I have to go, I said, my voice resolute. There's work to be done. Marjorie opened her mouth, but the words died there. Douglas didn't even look up. Ron and Blythe sat frozen, their world tilted on an axis they hadn't anticipated. Harper's hand trembled in the air like a question that would never have an answer. As I walked out of that room, I felt the dominoes falling behind me. One by one, their carefully constructed reality collapsing under the weight of the future they'd refused to see. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the outsider at their table. I felt like the man I'd always been, unapologetically building the future, one falling domino at a time. You're working from where now? Harper's voice wavered with disbelief, her hand trembling slightly as she clutched her handbag, the same one she'd proudly bought on our second anniversary, back when we thought gifts could patch holes in the foundation of a marriage. The early morning sun glinted off the mirrored glass of the high-rise in front of us, the Ether Core building, its logo reflecting like a promise I'd kept to myself for years. I stepped forward, pausing just beyond the revolving doors, and turned to face her. Her eyes darted between the building and me, confusion and uncertainty dancing in their depths. This is it, I said, letting the words hang in the air. My headquarters. She blinked, her lips parting like she wanted to argue, but the sight of the Ether Core logo silenced her. Ether Core, the same name that had rippled across the news and every financial feed in the country. The same name that had stunned her family, brought Douglas's company to its knees, and turned every whispered question into a shout. Marjorie muttered something under her breath, half shock, half scorn. You're telling me you own this place? She said, her voice teetering on the edge of disbelief. I didn't bother to hide the smile that crept across my face. Not just this floor, I replied, my voice calm, steady. I own the whole building. Every floor, every lab, every patent that's being developed inside. I paused, letting the weight of that settle on them like a stone. Welcome to the real Ether Core. Douglas's mouth twitched, the lines around his eyes tightening as he tried to make sense of the man standing in front of him. The man he dismissed as a dreamer, a drifter, a nobody with nothing but grand ideas and no follow-through. He didn't say a word, but the set of his jaw told me everything. Regret, confusion, the bitter realization that the son-in-law he'd written off had become the very future he'd failed to see. I led them through the glass doors and into the lobby, where the scent of polished steel and innovation hung in the air like an electric charge. The security desk greeted me with a respectful nod. The receptionist, bright-eyed, efficient, pressed a button, and the elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss. Harper stared at the receptionist's eager deference, at the staff moving with purpose and direction. They know you? She asked, her voice thin. I smiled. They work for me, Harper, I said. Every one of them. We stepped into the elevator, and I pressed the button for the top floor. The ride was silent except for the gentle hum of the machinery. Harper's eyes were glued to the digital floor indicator as the numbers climbed higher. The weight of every floor felt like a reckoning. When the doors opened, we stepped out into a world of glass and light, a sleek workspace that stretched to the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the skyline. The hum of servers, the subtle click of keyboards, and the low murmur of engineers deep in their world greeted us like an anthem. A team of data scientists huddled around a quantum simulation console, their faces bathed in the glow of progress. They looked up as I entered, nodding respectfully before returning to their work. "This is the Nerve Center," I said, gesturing to the labs beyond. "Quantum encryption, AI development, satellite communications. Everything EtherCore does starts here." I paused at the glass wall that framed the AI lab, a sleek, minimalist space with walls of screens displaying live simulations. My team was here. Brilliant minds from around the world, drawn by the promise of working on the bleeding edge of technology. Marjorie's eyes darted around, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't know," she stammered. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her designer scarf, the same one she'd worn at that dinner where she'd tried to hand me job listings. Harper's voice was hushed, barely a whisper. "You really are the founder," she said, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. All this time, her gaze swept across the room, over the whiteboards scribbled with equations that would one day redefine cybersecurity, over the 3D printer humming with a prototype of our next encryption module, over the satellite models being prepped for testing. She turned back to me, her eyes glassy with the realization that the man she'd thought she knew had been building an empire under her nose. Marjorie finally found her voice. "I thought you were wasting your time," she said, voice ragged. "Sitting at that old computer, always talking about encryption. I thought." She trailed off, the words falling like ashes from her lips. I turned to her, my expression neutral. "You thought I was playing with toys," I finished for her. "But I was building the future." Douglas cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "This place, it's incredible," he said, his tone a mixture of awe and regret. I had no idea." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "No," I said. "You didn't. And that's the difference between us. I believed in the future when it was nothing but lines of code in a basement. You needed it to come with a guarantee." We moved through the lab, past the secure clean room where technicians in sterile suits worked on quantum processors that would one day make today's encryption look like a rusty lock. Marjorie whispered to Harper, her voice trembling. I didn't realize what he'd been doing all day." The words were almost a confession, a plea for forgiveness for every time she dismissed me as a dreamer with no direction. We reached the rooftop garden, a place I designed as a haven for my team, a reminder that innovation and balance weren't mutually exclusive. The skyline stretched out in every direction, a living, breathing testament to the future I'd carved from every doubt, every rejection, every sneer. Harper stood beside me, the wind teasing her hair. "You really did it," she said softly, her voice filled with something like wonder. "You built it all." I turned to her, my gaze steady. "And then some," I said, my voice carrying the weight of every sacrifice I'd made, every night I'd spent working while the rest of the world slept. For a moment, the old ache between us softened. She reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. Instead, I let her see the man I'd always been. The man she'd refused to see. The man who'd built a future that no one could deny. "Sir, we've acquired the remaining shares in Douglas's firm," my assistant informed me, his voice crisp and efficient as he met my gaze from across my sleek, glass-topped desk. The early afternoon sun streamed through the panoramic windows of the EtherCore tower, painting lines of light on the polished floors and reminding me of just how far I'd come from the cramped apartment where this all began. I set down the tablet I'd been reviewing, a fresh batch of licensing contracts with aerospace partners, and let a small, satisfied smile tug at the corner of my mouth. "Thank you, Samuel," I said, my voice calm but carrying a gravity that even he couldn't miss. "Prepare the integration documents. We'll proceed as planned." He nodded and left, the quiet click of the door closing behind him echoing like a judge's gavel in my mind. I leaned back in my chair, hands steepled under my chin, and allowed myself a moment to savor the culmination of years of silent strategy. Douglas's firm, a family legacy once considered untouchable, was now a subsidiary of the company they'd mocked, dismissed, and belittled. I'd offered them a chance to join me when EtherCore was just an idea scribbled in the margins of my engineering notebook. They'd said no. They'd called it nonsense, a pipe dream, a waste of talent that would never amount to anything. I'd left that boardroom that day with a polite nod, but inside, I'd made a promise to myself. One day, they would see. One day, the name they'd laughed at would overshadow theirs. And now that day had come. Douglas had called an emergency board meeting at his firm, his voice tight with panic. as if he could somehow put the pieces back together by sheer force of will. I arrived at their headquarters, an aging building with a lobby that smelled like stale coffee and cheap carpet, and stepped into the boardroom like I owned the place. Because now, I did. Douglas sat at the head of the table, his hair thinner than I remembered, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of every missed opportunity was pressing him into the seat. Marjorie sat beside him, her face drawn and pale, lips pressed together in a line that told me she'd run out of arguments. The board members, men and women in suits that once carried authority, now looked at me with the wary eyes of survivors. I took the seat across from Douglas, the hum of the overhead lights punctuating the silence like a metronome. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my tone measured but carrying the kind of authority that had been forged in the fires of every rejection they'd handed me. "As you know, EtherCore has now acquired the remaining shares of Douglas's firm. Effective immediately, you are now a fully owned subsidiary of EtherCore Technologies." A ripple of murmurs ran through the boardroom, disbelief and panic lacing the air like a bitter perfume. Douglas's jaw clenched. "Scott," he said, his voice stripped of its usual condescension, "surely we can discuss this. There must be a way to preserve our independence." I regarded him with the same steady calm I'd used to guide billion-dollar deals across the finish line. "Douglas," I said, leaning forward just slightly, "I offered you a partnership when we were just getting started. You called it nonsense. Now, I'm offering you 3 paths." I held up 3 fingers. Full integration into EtherCore, a partial buyout with limited influence, or dissolution with asset absorption. The silence stretched, each breath in the room measured and tense. I watched the board members' eyes dart between me and Douglas, their expressions caught between hope and fear. Marjorie's voice cracked as she spoke. "Scott, please. We built this company from the ground up. It's our legacy. Can't you just let it stand on its own?" Her eyes shimmered, desperation cracking through the polished exterior she'd worn like armor for so long. I shook my head slowly. "Marjorie, legacies aren't built by clinging to the past. They're built by adapting to the future. And the future is quantum, AI, next-generation security, things you never believed in." I let the weight of those words settle, watching her flinch at the realization that everything they'd dismissed had become the very thing that would determine their survival. Douglas's shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him in a slow exhale, and he looked at the table like it might hold the answers he'd failed to find. "Integration," he said finally, his voice hollow. "We'll integrate." A quiet hum of resigned acceptance passed around the table. I stood, gathering the documents Samuel had prepared, and handed Douglas an NDA. "Before we proceed," I said, my tone unyielding, "you'll need to sign this. It ensures the security of EtherCore's systems and prevents any leaks. It's standard procedure." He took the papers with trembling hands, his fingers brushing mine briefly as he accepted the contract. In that touch, I felt the cold finality of every bridge he'd burned. Every opportunity he'd squandered because he couldn't see past the limits of his own imagination. I turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. The room was heavy with the silence of people who'd seen the world they'd built slip through their fingers. "Douglas," I said, meeting his eyes one last time, "you taught me something valuable. That sometimes the people closest to you are the ones least likely to believe in your potential. I want you to remember that." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, and nodded mutely. As I stepped back into the corridor, Samuel fell into stride beside me. "Congratulations, sir," he said. "That was necessary," I finished for him. "It was necessary." Outside, the sun glinted off the skyline, each building a monument to dreams that had either thrived or died in the unforgiving crucible of business. I felt no gloating, no urge to celebrate. Only a quiet certainty that I'd kept the promise I'd made to myself that day they'd laughed me out of the boardroom. Legacy, I thought as I watched the traffic flow beneath the tower. It wasn't given. It was earned, forged in silence, built brick by the people who refused to accept the limits others set for them. I turned and headed back to the EtherCore tower, ready to sign the next deal, build the next frontier. The future was already here, and this time, no one could ignore it. Dinner's at 8. I've already reserved the rooftop. The text was simple, but the meaning was everything. This time, I was hosting the family dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant that, unbeknownst to them, I now owned. I wore a tailored obsidian black suit that fit me like it had been cut from my own ambition. Gone were the thrift store jeans, the scuffed boots. Today, I wasn't hiding anymore. As I entered the restaurant, the staff greeted me by name. A hush fell over the table when I approached. Marjorie tried to muster her trademark warmth, but her smile was brittle. Douglas mumbled something about being proud, but the words felt like an afterthought, rehearsed in the mirror before facing me. Harper looked nervous, fidgeting with her napkin, as if unsure what this dinner would reveal. I took my seat at the head of the table, the skyline gleaming behind me like a stage set for a play they'd all missed the rehearsal for. "Thank you for coming," I said, letting my voice carry just enough authority. Their eyes were wide, expectant, like children waiting for a verdict. They asked me about my future, about what I would do next. I let a slow smile creep across my face. "We're testing teleportation theory," I said lightly, letting the words hang in the air like a dare. "So busy." The room went silent. Even Marjorie's carefully crafted confidence faltered. Douglas stared at his plate. Harper's eyes darted to mine, searching for something familiar in the man across the table. I raised my glass. "To real jobs," I said. The toast hung in the air, shimmering with irony. Marjorie's hand trembled as she lifted her glass, her lips tight. Douglas's nod was slow, resigned. Harper's glass hovered in her hand, the tears she fought back making her eyes shine in the candlelight. In that moment, I knew they finally saw me. Not the man they tried to mold, but the man I'd become. And for the first time, I didn't need their approval. I had outgrown their table. "You've become ruthless," Harper said, her voice trembling with something between awe and fear as the elevator doors slid shut. The quiet hum of the lift surrounded us like a cocoon, cutting off the noise of the restaurant, the weight of family expectations, the half-hearted apologies that had been offered too late. I met her gaze, steady and unblinking. "No," I said. I became honest. My voice was calm, each word measured like a scalpel. I saw the truth hit her, the realization that the man standing in front of her wasn't the man she'd always tried to manage. The man she'd wanted was an illusion, a man who bowed to her family's expectations, who sat quietly at dinners and let them decide his worth. That man was gone. The elevator climbed higher, carrying me back to the penthouse, the space I'd built with every dollar they'd never known I had. Every late night, I'd spent coding and planning and dreaming. The city lights below glittered like stars, the skyline a testament to ambition and perseverance. I glanced at my phone. Our valuation had ticked past $21.6 billion. It felt like a line in the sand, a place where the boy they once dismissed became the man they could no longer ignore. I forwarded an email to my legal team, finalizing the trust disbursement plan I'd been working on for months. Underprivileged students in quantum computing would finally get their chance. The world I'd built was already changing lives. And Harper? She'd once called my experiments cute. Now, those same experiments were rewriting the laws of physics. The irony wasn't lost on me. As the elevator slowed, I turned to her. "You wanted safe," I said, voice low but resolute. "You wanted predictable. But I wanted the future." Her eyes glistened, tears brimming but never falling. She didn't have a response. There was nothing left to say. The doors slid open, revealing the polished corridor to my penthouse. I stepped out, leaving her in the elevator, an echo of a life that never understood the man she'd married. I didn't look back. The city was waiting, and for the first time, it was all mine.